There is a whisper that echoes through the corridors of time, a whisper carried by sages, mystics, and dreamers who dared to look beyond the fragile veil of flesh. It is the whisper of a forbidden possibility, the audacious claim that death itself is not the absolute end but a shadow cast upon a deeper light. Ancient teachings that reverse death itself is not merely a phrase, it is a summons, a trembling key that opens the door to mysteries too vast to be contained in language. To even begin to speak of such teachings is to step out of the ordinary rhythm of life, where mornings are bound to evenings and youth yields inevitably to age, and to enter into the timeless space where the boundaries of birth and decay dissolve into something larger, something unbroken. Death, to most, appears as the most final of truths, the immovable wall against which all human ambition crashes. It is the great equalizer, the silent thief who neither bargains nor waits. And yet, hidden in the ancient philosophies of Egypt, India, Greece, and even among the shamans of forgotten tribes, lies a thread woven with stubborn defiance. The suggestion that death is not an ending but a doorway, not an erasure but a transformation. More daring still, some teachings claim that the doorway itself is illusory, that what we call death is but a misinterpretation of a larger continuity. To embrace this view is to begin to question the very architecture of reality, to suspect that what we see, touch, and fear is not the whole but only the surface. Imagine, for a moment, the ocean to the waves at the surface. Their rising and falling feels like a life of its own, an existence beginning in the swell and ending in the collapse. Yet, if one listens deeply, the wave is never apart from the ocean. It is water reshaped, energy transferred, never destroyed. Ancient wisdom often points to this same truth regarding our lives. What appears to vanish into death may, in truth, be only the dissolving of form, or the essence, the unseen. To reverse death, then, may not mean stopping the decay of the body, but awakening to the recognition that the essence never dies, that the wave was never separate from the ocean in the first place. But some traditions whisper of something more radical. They tell of practices that allowed certain individuals to step out of the wheel of birth and death, to pierce the cycle, and to embody an eternal vitality that defied the ordinary laws of flesh. Taoist immortals, yogic siddhas, Egyptian initiates of Osirisol, were said to have touched a secret knowledge that allowed them to transmute the body into light, to walk the earth unbound by decay. Whether literal or metaphorical, these stories ignite the imagination, for they suggest that humanity is not condemned to live under the tyranny of mortality. Without question, there exists, hidden in plain sight, a library of wisdom that challenges our most basic assumptions. To speak of reversing death is not only to speak of the body, it is to speak of the death we suffer each day, the death of dreams abandoned too early, the death of courage strangled by fear, the death of wonder suffocated by routine. In this sense, these ancient teachings stretch far beyond the final breath. They remind us that death creeps in long before our bodies fail, each time we allow the spark of our soul to dim. Thus, to reverse death is also to reawaken, to stand against the slow erosion of spirit, to refuse the sleep of conformity. Death is not only an event, it is a condition of forgetfulness, and reversing it is the art of remembrance. The ancients understood this, which is why their instructions often carried a double edge: physical practices to sustain vitality, and symbolic rituals to awaken memory. The pyramids, the mandalas, the sacred chancel of them, were less about denying death than about reframing it, sculpting a consciousness so resilient that the thought of ending could no longer imprison it. Their goal was never mere longevity, but immortality in awareness, the capacity to walk through the valley of shadows without being diminished. What is striking, as we turn these teachings over in our hands, like ancient coins, is how contemporary they feel once stripped of mythic clothing. Modern science, with its explorations of energy, consciousness, and the strange mechanics of time, is beginning to brush against truths the ancients intuited. Quantum physics whispers that matter is not solid, that particles dance in and out of being. Neuroscience hints at the elasticity of consciousness, and in the spaces where science falters, mysticism offers metaphors of fire, light, and rebirth. Between these worlds, something extraordinary begins to shimmer, The possibility that mortality may not be the closed door we were taught to believe it is. Yet, it would be naive to think that such teachings can be grasped by intellect alone. To reverse death is not merely to hold an idea, is to embody a transformation so deep that even the cells of the body seem to recognize it. It demands a shift from fear to trust, from clinging to releasing, from identifying with the temporary to aligning with the eternal. It is less about conquering death than about dissolving the illusion that there was ever something to conquer. The ancients did not hand us a formula but a path, a series of initiations that strip away layer after layer of falsehood, until what remains is indestructible. As we embark on this exploration, we must remember that words themselves are fragile, like cups trying to contain the ocean. The teachings we will walk through are not cages of doctrine, but doorways of perception. They invite us not only to think differently about life and death, but to live differently in the face of them, to carry ourselves as if the boundaries were not as rigid as we once believed. If death is the greatest illusion, then to see through it is the greatest act of awakening. This is the invitation before us, to rediscover the fragments of wisdom scattered through time, to listen for the whispers of those who came before, and to let those whispers ignite a new kind of fire within. The path will take us through ancient texts and symbolic narratives, through the architecture of ritual and the science of transformation. But most of all, it will take us inward, toward the place where mortality loses its grip and the eternal makes itself known. If the introduction is the opening of the curtain, revealing a glimpse of the stage where these ancient teachings dwell, then the core themes are the pillars upon which the entire structure rests. To speak of reversing death is to speak in paradox, for it requires us to first admit what we have taken for granted, that death is final, immovable, and unquestionable. These teachings begin by asking us to loosen our grip on this assumption and to recognize that what we call death may not be as absolute as we believe. The ancients did not treat mortality as an inevitable wall, but as a veil, a shadow, or even a teacher, and in doing so, they unearthed insights that reach into the marrow of existence itself. At the heart of these teachings lies the concept of continuity. The universe, when examined with clear sight, reveals no true ending, only transformation. Energy never disappears, it only changes form. A star burns itself to ashes, but from its collapse, new worlds are born. A seed splits apart, yet from its rupture emerges a tree that will outlive generations. The ancients observed this rhythm and saw in it a mirror of human life. They asked, if energy cannot die, why should consciousness, which is more subtle than matter, be any different? Thus, the first pillar of these teachings is the recognition that death is not annihilation, but transition. Yet they went further still. Transition implies passage, movement from one state to another. But some traditions claim that what is most essential within us does not even pass. It simply is, like the sun hidden by clouds. It may appear veiled, but it never ceases to shine. This brings us to the second great theme, the immortality of awareness. In Vedantic philosophy, the Atman, the inner self, is described as unborn, undying, untouched by decay. Egyptian mystics spoke of the Ba and the Kuei twin aspects of the soul that transcend physical dissolution. The Taoists describe the eternal Tao as the undying current beneath all appearances. In each of these systems, the teaching is consistent. What you truly are cannot perish, because it was never born in the first place. This recognition leads to the third theme, death as illusion. To reverse death is to reverse the illusion that you were ever separate from life. The ancients often spoke of life and death as two sides of a single coin, both necessary for the play of existence, but neither holding ultimate truth. The illusion arises when we mistake the temporary for the eternal, when we cling to the body and forget the spirit animating it. Death then is a kind of misseeing, a trick of the senses. To pierce this illusion is not to abolish the body's decline, but to awaken to the fact that decline is only a garment worn by something that never ages. A fourth theme runs through nearly every ancient text on immortality, transformation. While death appears as an ending, the ancients understood it as an alchemical process, a transmutation of form into something higher. In Egyptian rituals, the initiates symbolically died before being reborn as an Osiris, a godlike being who conquered mortality. In the yogic paths of India, meditation, breath, and discipline were seen as fires that could burn away the dross of illusion, leaving behind the radiant core of immortality. Even in early Christian mysticism, the crucifixion and resurrection were less about physical events and more about the universal drama of transformation, death overcome by awakening. Thus, the act of reversing death is inseparable from the act of deep inner change. But there is another layer, the theme of remembrance. The ancients believed that our greatest tragedy was not death itself, but forgetting. To forget the eternal nature of the soul is to live as if we are already half dead, shackled by fear, clinging desperately to each moment, never tasting its fullness. Reversing death, then, begins with remembering the continuity, the immortality, the illusion, the transformation. Rituals, chants, symbols, and sacred texts were designed not as external magic but as tools to jog memory, to awaken the soul from its slumber. Memory of the eternal self was the antidote to the poison of mortality. These themes intertwine with yet another, mastery of perception. The ancients understood that life and death are not just events but ways of seeing. When we identify with the body alone, death looms like an inevitable executioner. But when perception shifts, when identity expands into the soul, the spirit, or the universal consciousness, death loses its sting. Perception, they taught, is reality. If you perceive yourself as mortal, you will live and die within those boundaries. If you perceive yourself as eternal, you step beyond them. The battlefield is the mind, and victory lies in vision. Perhaps the most radical theme of all is the idea that the reversal of death is not only metaphysical but experiential. The ancients spoke of states where death could be transcended while still alive. Shamans entered trance and returned with visions of the afterlife, declaring that they had crossed the threshold and come back whole. Yogis sat in deep meditation until their breath ceased, only to emerge radiant, declaring themselves untouched by time. Taoist alchemists whispered of turning the body itself into a vessel of light, bypassing decay altogether. Whether one interprets these accounts as literal or symbolic, they converge upon a single revelation: the possibility of living deathless, even within the frame of mortality. In weaving these themes together, we begin to see a tapestry of immense depth, continuity, immortality, illusion, transformation, remembrance, perception, and experiential transcendence. Each is a thread, but together they form a vision of existence that defies the despair of finality. They remind us that to live with a constant fear of death is to live half a life, and to see through death's illusion is to step into a freedom so vast that even time bends around it. This is the foundation upon which the symbolic stories and allegories relate are built. Stories designed to carry these truths into the hearts of those not ready for abstraction. Just as myths of resurrection, ascension, and immortal heroes fill the ancient texts, so too they carry the seed of these core concepts, dressed in images and symbols that ignite imagination and faith. To truly understand the ancients, we must not only hear their words but feel their rhythm, sense their breath behind the language. For what they offer is not simply knowledge of life and death, but a way of seeing that renders both as stages of a play whose true author is eternal consciousness. If the core teachings offer us the architecture, then the symbolic narratives are the stained glass windows that flood that structure with color and light. The ancients, knowing that raw philosophy could not always pierce the heart, draped their insights in stories, myths, and allegories. Through these stories, they gave shape to the invisible, voice to the ineffable, and body to the unseen truths that lived beyond the veil of words. To explore ancient teachings that reverse death itself is therefore to listen to these stories not as quaint relics but as coded transmissions, messages wrapped in metaphor, carrying sparks of wisdom across centuries. Consider the Egyptian myth of Osiris, betrayed by his brother Set, cut into pieces, and scattered across the land. Osiris is reassembled by Isis and brought to life again. This tale has often been read as a myth of resurrection, but beneath its imagery lies a teaching about the nature of death itself. Osiris is not destroyed by dismemberment, he's transformed. Death, in this myth, is not annihilation but disintegration, followed by reintegration into a higher form. Osiris does not return as a mere mortal, he returns as a ruler of the afterlife, a god whose authority extends beyond the boundaries of time. The lesson is clear: through death, when seen rightly, lies not an end, but an elevation. To embrace one's own fragmentation and reconstitution is to awaken to a state beyond death. The yogic traditions of India tell a similar story in the form of Shiva, the eternal yogi who sits at the cremation grounds. Surrounded by burning pyres, Shiva dances the dance of creation and destruction, embodying the paradox that life and death are not opposites but intertwined movements of the same rhythm. The cremation ground, feared as a place of endings, becomes the sacred ground of awakening, where attachment is burned away and the eternal is revealed. Here, the symbolic narrative teaches that to reverse death is to enter willingly into its fire, to let the flames consume the full self until only the deathless core remains. In Greek mythology, Orpheus descends into the underworld to retrieve his beloved Eurydice with his music. He softens the hearts of Hades and Persephone, who allow him to lead her back on one condition, that he'd not look back. Yet, overcome with doubt, he turns, and she vanishes forever. The story speaks to the fragility of human faith and the peril of clinging to what must be released. Orpheus fails, but the myth instructs us in the art of trust. To reverse death requires an unwavering gaze toward life, a refusal to look back at shadows, for fixation on what is lost binds us to mortality. In this story, death is reversed, not through brute force but through harmony, faith, and surrender, qualities that the ancients saw as keys to immortality. Among the Taoists, we find the tale of the feathered immortals. These were said to be ordinary practitioners who, through alchemy of breath and spirit, grew light enough to ascend into the heavens, their bodies dissolving into pure qi. One story tells of He Shanggu, a woman who consumed powdered mica and lotus flowers until she achieved immortality, her body becoming translucent, her step as light as air. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the narrative conveys a vital lesson. To reverse death is to lighten one's being, to shed the density of fear, desire, and clinging until what remains is weightless enough to rise beyond decay. Even in the Christian narrative of resurrection, we find symbols resonant with this theme. Christ, placed in the tomb, does not emerge as the same man who entered. His body is radiant, transfigured, unbound by walls or locks. The stone is rolled away, not by human strength, but by a force beyond matter itself. The story is less about returning to life as it was, and more about entering into a new mode of being, one that transcends the laws of death. In this light, resurrection is not the reversal of death as negation, but as transformation, life transmuted into a higher octave. Shamanic traditions of indigenous peoples across the world also hold symbolic narratives of death and rebirth. A shaman often undergoes a symbolic death during initiation. They dream of being dismembered, their flesh stripped away, their bones boiled clean, only to be reassembled with new strength. This harrowing vision, though terrifying, is not an end, is a doorway into a new identity, one who has died and yet lives, carrying the knowledge of both worlds. The teaching embedded in this initiation is profound. To reverse death, one must first embrace it, allow it to strip away all false layers until only essence remains. Taken together, these narratives form a chorus singing a single truth: death, when seen through the eyes of wisdom, is not final but transformative. Each story dresses the truth in different garments: Osiris in regal robes, Shiva in ashes, Orpheus with a lyre, Christ with light, shamans with bone and fire. But the melody is the same. Death is a passage, and the key to reversing it lies not in resisting it, but in surrendering to the transformation it heralds. Yet these stories also carry warnings. They remind us that immortality is not granted to the unprepared. Orpheus falters because he cannot trust. Osiris achieves divinity only after being torn apart. Shamans emerge whole only after suffering symbolic annihilation. The path of reversing death is not without peril. It demands the courage to lose everything in order to gain what cannot be lost. It is a paradox. Only those who accept death fully can move beyond it. In this way, the symbolic narratives are not just tales, they are maps. They instruct the listener in how to navigate the terrain of mortality, with faith, with surrender, with willingness to be broken open. They reveal that immortality is not a denial of death, but its completion, its transmutation into something luminous and eternal. The myths and allegories of the ancients are not meant to remain as lofty tales told by firelight or inscribed upon temple walls. They were always intended to be lived, to be breathed into the marrow of daily existence. To speak of reversing death in practical terms is to ask, how do these ancient teachings alter the way we walk, eat, breathe, speak, love, and dream? How do they move from parchment and myth into pulse and presence? It is here, in this weaving of the symbolic into the ordinary, that their true power unfolds. The first implication is the shift in how we perceive time. When we live bound by the fear of death, time feels like sand slipping through our fingers, always vanishing, never enough. The ancients taught that to see through death's illusion is to step outside of this panic, to recognize that time's not a trap but a field. The yogis spoke of Kala Chakra, the wheel of time, in which beginnings and endings dissolve into cycles. Taoist sages compared life to the movement of seasons, where winter is not an end but a quiet gestation before spring's return. To integrate this vision into modern life is to move with time instead of against it, to see each ending as a threshold rather than a theft. Imagine living without the terror of running out of time. What choices would you make differently if you knew that essence cannot expire? A second implication rests in how we hold the body. If death is not the annihilation we once feared, the body ceases to be a fragile prison and becomes instead a sacred vessel of transformation. Practices such as yoga, qigong, breathwork, or even simple mindful movement are not just exercises for health. They are ways of tuning the body into alignment with the eternal current that flows through it. The ancients treated the body as clay on the potter's wheel, to be shaped, purified, and lightened until he could channel the undying. For us today, this means caring for the body not merely out of fear of sickness or decay, but as an act of reverence for the temple that holds consciousness. When we eat with awareness, breathe deeply, walk in rhythm with the earth, we participate in the ancient alchemy of preparing the body to remember its immortality. But perhaps the deepest integration lies in the realm of fear. The fear of death is often the unspoken root of all other fears. Fear of loss, of failure, of insignificance. When one sees through the illusion of death, a profound courage arises. Courage not rooted in recklessness, but in freedom. The warrior traditions of many cultures understood this well. The samurai were taught to meditate upon death each day, to make peace with it until it no longer gripped them. From this state, they could act with clarity, unbound by hesitation. In our own lives, this integration might mean pursuing dreams without the paralysis of what if I fail, loving without holding back, or speaking truth without trembling. To reverse death in the psyche is to unshackle the human spirit. There is also the practical matter of relationships. If life is eternal and death is but transformation, then each connection we form carries a depth beyond what is visible. The Egyptians placed great emphasis on maintaining bonds with ancestors, for they believed the departed were never gone but continued to walk beside the living. Indigenous traditions around the world echo this reverence for ancestors, recognizing death not as departure but as change of address. In practical terms, this means living with a consciousness of continuity, honoring those who came before, nurturing bonds of love that outlast the body, and recognizing that every meeting may be part of a vast tapestry that stretches beyond lifetimes. Such awareness can heal the loneliness that often haunts modern existence. Another integration is the reclamation of ritual. In modern culture, death is often hidden, sterilized, and feared. Yet the ancients wove rituals around death and transformation not to escape it, but to embrace its teaching. Funerary rites, seasonal ceremonies, even daily prayers were not superstitions, but acts of remembrance that what dies is only form, and what lives is eternal essence. For us today, ritual can be as simple as lighting a candle in the morning, pausing to breathe before meals, or marking life's thresholds with intentional acts of meaning. Rituals remind us, in embodied ways, of truths that words alone cannot carry. A further implication touches the realm of creativity. When freed from the chokehold of mortality, the human mind awakens to its role as a co-creator with the eternal. The ancients saw creativity, whether through art, music, architecture, or poetry, as a form of immortality, a way to channel eternal truths into tangible expression. The pyramids, the Vedas, the Tao Te Ching, the stories of resurrection are acts of creation that transcend the fleeting life of their makers. In modern life, creativity becomes not just a hobby but a sacred act of defying death, of leaving a trace of eternity within time. To paint, to write, to build, to sing, these are ways of saying, I am not confined to dust, I am part of the eternal current. Practical integration also reaches into the way we face loss. Death is not only about the body, it is about the countless endings that punctuate life. Jobs end, relationships fade, chapters close. To see death as transformation rather than annihilation changes how we grieve. Grief remains, but it is laced with a quiet knowing that nothing essential is ever lost. This awareness does not diminish the pain but infuses it with dignity and depth, turning loss into a teacher rather than a tyrant. Finally, there is the implication of presence. If the soul is eternal and death is illusion, then the most radical act of reversing death is to fully inhabit the now. The ancients spoke of eternity not as an endless stretch of time, but as the ever-present moment in which all things exist simultaneously. To live in presence is to taste immortality here and now, without waiting for another world or another form. Each breath, taken with awareness, becomes a resurrection. Each glance, held with love, becomes eternal. Presence is the living reversal of death, available to anyone who dares to step into it. Thus, the practical implications of these teachings are not distant or abstract. They touch every corner of life. How we see time, how we treat the body, how we confront fear, how we nurture relationships, how we create, how we grieve, and how we live moment to moment. To integrate them is to weave eternity into the fabric of the everyday. It is to live as though we are already immortal, not in arrogance, but in reverence. To arrive at this point in our exploration is to stand at a threshold, not unlike those the ancients spoke of in their myths. We have walked through the introduction, where death was unveiled as a shadow rather than a finality. We traced the pillars of the teachings, the themes of continuity, transformation, and remembrance. We wandered through stories draped in metaphor: Cyrus dismembered and reborn, Shiva dancing in the cremation grounds, Orpheus faltering at the edge of the underworld, shamans stripped to their bones and rebuilt anew. We then asked how these stories might breathe in the present, how they shape the way we live, love, create, and grieve. Now we stand in the final chamber, where the question is not simply what do these teachings mean, but how do we embody them, and what becomes of us when we do? The great paradox is this: to reverse death is not to cling to life, but to let go of the fear that life can never be lost. The reversal happens not by denying the body's fate, but by dissolving the illusion that you are the body alone. The teachings call us into a deep identification with the current that animates, with the awareness that witnesses, with the eternal flame that does not flicker even as the forms around it crumble. In this shift, a profound liberation occurs. You cease to live as a prisoner, counting the days until execution, and begin to live as one who knows the sun will rise again even if the night feels endless. This is why the ancients framed their wisdom as initiation rather than instruction. It is not enough to hear these truths. One must undergo them. Each of us must, in our own way, step into the fire, descend into the underworld, allow ourselves to be torn apart and reassembled. For some, this may come through the grief of losing someone we love, through illness, through failure, through heartbreak. It's a small rehearsal of death. And yet, within these dark nights, the opportunity emerges to recognize that even in the ashes, something remains unburned. To reverse death is not to avoid these experiences, but to walk through them with eyes open, refusing to mistake the end of one form for the end of all. What does this mean for how we live? It means to live unshackled, to love without withholding, to risk without the paralysis of fear, to create as if your work carries the voice of eternity itself. It means to honor your ancestors not as lost ghosts but as living presences, to grieve not with despair but with reverence, to face endings as transformations in disguise. Most of all, it means to awaken in each moment, for presence itself is the taste of immortality. The eternal does not arrive in some distant future, it is here, now, woven into the pulse of your heart and the rhythm of your breath. And there is a deeper calling still. These teachings do not merely invite us to free ourselves, they invite us to participate in the great work of freeing humanity from the terror of death. Imagine a world where children are taught not to fear mortality, but to honor life as eternal. Imagine cultures where funerals are not silent despair, but sacred celebrations of transformation. Imagine societies that value creativity, courage, and love precisely because they are recognized as the immortal expressions of spirit. Such a world is not impossible, it is simply waiting for enough individuals to remember. To embrace these teachings is to become a living bridge between time and eternity. You carry within you both the vulnerability of flesh and the indestructibility of spirit. You are the wave and the ocean, the flame and the fire, the seed and the tree. To reverse death is not to deny one side of the paradox but to hold both. In reverence, to walk this earth knowing you are dust, and yet more than dust, fragile and eternal at once. And so the transformational call is this: let death no longer be your jailer, let it instead be your teacher, your initiator, your mirror. Let each small ending in your life be an invitation to see continuity, to taste the immortal. Begin with presence, inhale, exhale. Notice that the awareness, witnessing this breath, has no age. Remember that each time you love without fear, each time you create with abandon, each time you surrender instead of clinging, you are reversing death in the only way that matters, by proving that spirit cannot be extinguished. The ancients have left their whispers, their symbols, their maps, but the final act belongs to you. It is you who must walk the path, who must live as if the veil has already been lifted. To reverse death is not an achievement. Waiting in some distant horizon is the choice to awaken now, to step into the eternal current that was always carrying you. So the question is not whether these teachings are true. The question is whether you will dare to live as if they are.